Joining me today are Darren Woolley, the CEO of Trinity P3, and Ryan Shelley, the Managing Director of Pepper IT. Gents, there was a really interesting story on social media this morning, which I'm sure you've seen, which was the story of the gentleman who was removed forcibly from the United Airlines flight in the US. I'm just going to play a short clip now, and really I just get your reaction as a way of sort of kicking us into the conversation about social media.
Look at all those phones. Every second person on the plane's got their phone out.
Well, I think businesses today have to accept the fact that every customer is a potential journalist. I mean, we've all got mobile phones. We can all videotape what's going on. And social media allows you to spread that as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. And bad news spreads much better than good news. So organisations have to be prepared to be able to manage these crises at any time.
Right.
Yeah, agree. Bad news is always going to spread quicker than how good the service was on an airline. I think United has to, hand on heart, own the problem and publicly, do the right thing and make amends for it.
Because this is one of the issues, is that the time that it takes to go viral or go crazy is much shorter these days, isn't it? So, businesses can't sit around deciding what they're going to do when a crisis breaks. They've got to have a process of dealing with it in that moment.
Or even better yet, companies, especially, large companies like United, they should have a ready-to-fire, scripted, response for situations like this. And then that way, as Darren suggested, it's something that can be fired immediately.
So one of the things that struck me, probably about an hour after the incident started to propagate across all of social media, it was there in my Facebook feed, my LinkedIn feed, and my Twitter feed this morning when I got up. There was a statement from the CEO of United, and the thing that struck me was I thought it was clever in the sense he kept his options open. He gave what on the surface looks like an apology, but he also said that they were investigating. And one of the issues that always strikes me, and maybe it's because I'm a journalist, is I always like to kind of wait and see what the facts reveal. Now, admittedly, in this case, it doesn't look great for them. But in that context, where things are happening quickly, where there's a lot of media, where basically everybody's going at you because they're driving clicks, what's the best way? How do you take stock and how do you approach it?
Look, and the CEO came out with exactly the old school media approach, which is don't admit liability, let's all be cautious, let's wait till we have the facts. The trouble is they're missing a great opportunity. Because whether they're liable or not, what he should be doing is going on the front foot and going, this is unfortunate and we're investigating the cause, but we would never allow a customer to be treated that way, and so this is what we're going to do, A, B, C, D. Give them a first-class flights for a year or whatever, because you've got to be in the moment. In 12 hours, 24 hours or a week from now when all the facts are in, no one's going to care anymore, except that they'll remember that United Airlines beats up their customers.
And on that, you're uncovering a wound. By the time they've got their response prepared, you've pulled the Band-Aid off, the scab comes off, and everyone goes, oh, that's right, United, they kicked that poor bloke off.
In fact, that was the thing that struck me, was that, to me, it really revealed not so much weaknesses in social media policy, we'll watch that unfold over the next few weeks, but just basic weaknesses in operating policy. Really, social media exposes when you don't have your process down pat.
Corporate affairs are still these big organisations are still struggling with the new media model. They know about the 24-hour news cycle, but that's with journalists, and journalists do want to get the facts. These, what do they call them?
Keyboard warriors.
Everyday journalists are not bound by the same rules, or don't seem to be bound by the same rules. They just spread the information that's provided to them. That's why you've got to be constantly on the front foot. And this idea of playing it safe, sure, it'll end up sorting itself out in the end, but you've missed the opportunity to completely turn the whole thing around on its head.
So is it a big part of the problem that a lot of, particularly in corporate environments, a lot of the processes that are put in place are still based on fairly old operating assumptions of how information will be disseminated? Is that
Absolutely.
one of the issues?
Yeah, and they love having their relationships with all their journalists that are big influencers, and they build those relationships. It's not going to be those journalists that are going to bring you undone. It's going to be the customer that thinks that they're badly done by, and they're going to hit the social media with a piece of material, a message that's going to become a meme and just go viral, and suddenly hundreds of thousands of people, while you're still trying to get that journalist on the phone or on the email to try and counter it.
Look, most companies are, they're talking about their products and services well, they're acknowledging customer complaints well. That's what they're doing well. Doing unwell, things like this, they need to have prepared statements ready to pull the trigger and fire when things like this happen.
It's interesting because if you go back, Witch50 is 4 years old now, and when I started 4 years ago, the only two things boards really were aware of in terms of digital was cyber risk, and they're actually pretty good at that. Like that's a regulatory issue, and they've got that under control. And they're kind of aware of brand risk on social media, but it tended to be very tactical. It tended to be because they were responding to a specific kind of incident that had happened.
Yeah, there's still a mentality in a lot of senior boards and senior management that if I don't say anything, I won't be fanning the flames. And it's just ridiculous. This idea of creating a vacuum and the fire will go out. Now, what happens is when you don't say anything, you're letting everyone else stoke the fire with whatever they want. And they'll bring whatever agenda they want to the party, and it will just burn like wildfire. And the longer you stay there going, it's so old school. Let's not say anything and tomorrow it'll be gone away. No, by tomorrow you'll be looking at a scorched earth policy, potentially. And so that idea of waiting is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
The other thing is, it's interesting though that so many brands get customer service so right on social media, because that is about reacting in real time and solving people's problems.
I actually wanted to see if we can get some examples out of the conversation today of great service. Like we've sort of looked at the United, it's almost the kind of worst case example of what can happen.
Yeah, it's a mindset that your customers are important, so that the people at the front line have to be able to action the response. I mean, an airline that does it really well is Air New Zealand. They have a complete focus on their customers. And a friend of mine was sitting in the Air New Zealand lounge in LAX, and they were playing like elevator music, Barry Manilow, and they tweeted that they hoped that there was a better choice. And within 5 minutes, the person at the lounge there walked across and said, "Here's the catalogue. What would you like to listen to?" And then they tweeted that very story and put it on Facebook and everywhere else. So you get that amplifying effect from something so small, but it actually takes a culture and a mindset to deliver that. Just saying, we've done our social media bit tick is never going to work.
Do consumers use different social channels differently in terms of how they interact with brands? I always think Twitter's one of those environments where you just go and scream because you're angry. In fact, I did it this week over my brand new Fitbit Blaze because I took the watch band off and I couldn't get it back on, and for about an hour, three of us tried to fix it. I was so angry, and I was so happy an hour ago when I made the purchase. But I always think that Twitter's one of those things, it's kind of instant, it's reactive, you're just getting out there and raging. Whereas Facebook, it's almost more, companies that use Facebook well, it's actually more about the kind of dialogue and the conversation. So is there evidence that consumers make a distinction in terms of social channels they use to talk to, in terms of the way that they talk to brands?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the consumer. Demographics and that. You might have more people on Facebook that are happy to speak to companies on Facebook, whereas Twitter, probably more the tech-savvy people that, are comfortable with Twitter and sending out the, disgruntled tweet. I'd say there's probably more demographic as opposed to a, conscious decision about, I'm disappointed, therefore I'll go to Twitter, or I'm happy, therefore I'll go to Facebook.
I think also it's because, people know that journalists follow Twitter because that's where news breaks, because of that instantaneous nature. Twitter's all about in the moment, whereas Facebook is more about relationships, building a connection and engagement of shared values. And then LinkedIn is different again because, it's a B2B area. It's much more about professional thought leadership and networking and building. So I think this really strong social media platforms, each have their own strength, unique strengths. Snapchat is so instantaneous, but it's also, unlike Twitter, it's all visual. It's not lots and lots of text, or 140 characters.
And more unofficial behind the scenes. Yeah. It's not and that's a very good point you make about the journalists and that on Twitter. So many clients are like, oh, well, we don't really use Twitter. And the biggest example is when you watch the 6 o'clock news or the 7 o'clock news, the journalists aren't putting their Facebook name underneath their talking head. They're putting their Twitter handle. Yeah. So again, Twitter, if you want potentially attention of journalists and people that might be able to, see your disappointment with companies, that's why people are going to Twitter.
The other issue that was filling the newspapers and the airwaves at the time we recorded this podcast was the problems that Pepsi had, or rather the trouble they got themselves into with the commercial they created with Kendall Jenner, where they were attempting to kind of co-opt some of the popular movements in the US. I asked Darren and Ryan to comment on this.
Oh, look, one of the things is that I think brands have to be very careful when they try and co-opt social change or social trends. It's like anything, and in social media, advertisers especially, focus on the media part of social media and not the social part of social media. And the way I explain it to people is, imagine you and I right now having a conversation about our holidays coming up, and suddenly Travel Centre or something comes along and goes, I've got 50% off airlines at the moment. As a real life conversation, you just turn around and job them in the mouth, because we're having a conversation about holidays. I don't want you to sell to me while I'm having a social interaction. You could come in and go, I've been there and here's some interesting places, and actually add to the experience. I think Pepsi have done the same thing. There's a big trend about rebellion and revolution, perhaps driven by what's happened in the US, the shift towards the alt-right and, the reaction to that. But if you're going to go in and start messing in things that people feel passionate about, make sure you do it in a way that's respectful and moves the conversation forward, not just stomps all over it to sell some fizzy carbonated water.
And with Pepsi, it seems to be, I remember as a kid growing up, it was always, the taste of the new generation. They seem to be sticking with this theme of revolution and that for such a long time now. And I agree wholeheartedly. Consumers are savvy. A consumer will see, a call to arms about, let's revolt and that, and people will go, hang on a minute. This isn't about changing the world. This is about selling more brown fizzy drink. So consumers are savvy, and companies need to stop treating consumers like fools. And as you said, they also need to be aware and say, if they do overhear a conversation about someone getting engaged or going on holidays, they've got to market to those people. But they need to market to those people without making it obvious that they're marketing to those people.
Yeah. It's almost like you need a department of authenticity to make sure your authenticity policy is up to date.
You've just got to be a human being.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us today. Next week we will be back with our final podcast where we look at the issue of design-led thinking. Design-led thinking grew out of the architecture industry, but has more recently been co-opted by the software development sector, particularly with regards to developing products and particularly app-based products. So we will see you next week. Thank you very much.